Hey everyone, it's Michael Frank from the Prefab podcast, back with Toby Long. Today, the second in our series of demystifying certain parts of prefab. Luckily, we've moved on from the less fun conversation topic of last week of fire rebuilds to today. We're talking about a fun one that me and Toby both have a good amount of experience in, which is building in mountain towns. And what we really mean when we say mountain towns is we mean ski towns. Both of us spend a good amount of time in Lake Tahoe, have done some work here. Toby's done some work in some other places. As have I, mostly in the West Coast mountains, though I guess I've done some stuff kind of in upstate New York near Hunter as well. With that being said, welcome, Toby. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. This is fun. Up at Tahoe now, so I can reflect on just a salient topic.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah. Me and Toby are both pretty avid skiers, so we both spend time in the North Lake Tahoe.
It's a life work balance thing, right?
It's all research and development when you're skiing.
You get a lot of work done on the chairlift, I find.
It's good to know. So if you talk to Toby and it sounds like there's a chairlift in the background, probably. Okay, Toby, it would be great to get a quick bio of your experiences. I know you have some beautiful projects on your site from Colorado ski towns and North Lake Tahoe ski towns like Truckee and Olympic Valley. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about your experience building there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Michael, thanks again for hosting these. I think this is a great opportunity to download and share our collective experiences with people. So hopefully folks find this valuable. Just as the early bio, right? So I'm an architect. I've been working in the prefab space for like 25 years. I think naturally the work in the offsite construction space finds its way into conversations in mountain towns. I think that the process of building in the mountains is becoming more difficult with each passing year. Resources are limited. Subcontractors are scarce. The workforce has been displaced by high value real estate. The economics of construction continue to escalate. Obviously, the weather cycle is tough. And so, working with factory partners and deploying offsite construction, particularly modular building, I think is a natural evolution of what's going to be continuing to happen in mountain towns. I think we can see that as we look out to some of the entrepreneurship that's taking place. Even state grants. I've been hearing a lot about Colorado is trying to make active moves into really pushing for offsite construction, not just for the fancy stuff on the slopes, but workforce housing in
Yep.
particular.
Nevada
We found,
County, which is where Truckee is, just this week passed that Placer County, which is the other kind of main North Lake Tahoe County, has had this for a while, but that you can use tiny homes, which is really not the high end of the spectrum, as permanent
yeah,
residence for ADUs. And that's about as kind of offsite construction as you can get.
yeah. So I think that this is a kind of natural growth and evolution of the industry. It is being served by several marketplaces now in a variety of different categories. I think oddly, like some of the big manufacturers are actually in mountain towns. Out in Boise, Idaho, we know there's a whole collection of
Yeah.
manufacturers, largely in the multifamily space. But I think there's a home for projects like these kinds of projects in the mountains for sure. I also think that we can demystify a little bit of, at least from my own perspective, yours clearly as well, Michael, just that this is possible, that you can design buildings that are resilient to the environmental conditions or that carry heavy snow or various things that maybe people don't really immediately associate with modular building. I think that's a common question we get. Can you do it in the snow? Well, the answer is yes. And maybe we could talk about a few of the considerations that go into that.
Yeah, totally. Okay, I'll make a few points, and then we'll start to jump into a checklist. In addition to all the building we do for clients, I just built a personal residence near Palisades, or formerly known as Squaw Valley. So I have experience doing this both corporately and also as a place to live and have to live with, mostly positively, the decisions that we made in terms of modular. But yeah, it can very much be done. In terms of the high level, this is why I think this is happening, right? And I think Toby mentioned a lot of this. The building season in these areas, because of snow, is short, right? We're talking about sometime in the late spring to like October, more or less. And that's just like for excavation, like you're literally not allowed to start shoveling in some of these places in November or December. So being able to build most of the actual structure of your house in a factory that is temperature controlled in December, or October, or February, or whenever, and then be able to in May when there starts being deliveries, have that drop and then like be able to finish the house up over the summer is, I mean, it's what we just did. And then Toby talked about the other aspect, which is a part of the value consideration on modular construction is just we're going to take labor from a high cost of living area to a more affordable cost of living area. In some of these towns, right? Everyone sort of has heard about the housing crunch, whether it's in Tahoe or in Vail or Aspen or wherever. It's really hard to have lower cost labor. So this can be a positive thing in terms of providing work for areas where there's a bigger labor pool. So I think those are high level things. Having said that, as I've learned and we've worked up with clients, there are some different considerations when building with these areas with inclement clients. I mean, with inclement weathers, not inclement clients. So I want to sort of talk about some of the things that I think about, and then maybe Toby, you can chime in. And the first one I want to just talk about is really site diligence, right? Like, we constantly get the email of, hey, there's this remote piece of land, like 17 miles from Jackson Hole. Can we just put a box there? And usually the answer is not that easily. But what are the things you look for in terms of ski town? Yeah, just land diligence.
I think that is like number one, kind of, because I think naturally any place in the mountain, we don't have these aren't cities, right?
Right.
These are small towns, and there is a lot of property outside of most of the ski areas that is rural, undeveloped, kind of
Right.
property. I think you're right. I think that, understanding the ability to deliver and have logistics take place is really important. As a note of optimism for the viewers, there is a lot of technology and a lot of technique that can go into this too. We've brought modules down roads with excavators in the past. There's ways to kind of navigate across undeveloped property to an extent. I don't want to overestimate that, but I do think it's a note of optimism and certainly an encouragement to not rule anything out right away. From Michael and I and other professionals in this space, I think you can solicit advice to try to get a general understanding. One of the things that seems to happen in all of our projects is that all properties, for the most part, require some ability to access the property with fire department apparatus. We got to get fire departments out to these properties, however rural they are. And it has been my experience that the geometry required for fire apparatus and the geometry required for modular deliveries, at least of a
Fairly
certain size,
similar.
are kind of similar in some
Yeah.
ways. Particularly cranes, off-road cranes, and there's ways to do this, but I think that's really important. The other thing that I shows up a lot in our projects, Michael, is that, it's one thing to be in a suburban environment and you've got, oak trees and beech, like you've got these deciduous trees and they're all a certain height and you can kind of, but, most of the mountain towns have really tall pine trees. We can't lift over pine trees, so you
Yeah.
have kind of move through this. And maybe in some ways, dealing with trees, particularly in Tahoe, is a little bit forgiven because of just how forestry is taking place here and the fire hazards give us a kind of accommodation on trees, but also to be respectful of the environment and to not remove, clear cut property.
Mhm.
Sure. We can't, lift over it. You got to kind of navigate through it. As you may have seen on your property, there's a little ballet, right, that happens with the crane and
Right.
lifting it, and you can kind of maneuver. But trees become an important part of this consideration too. If it's in a really pine treed area, sometimes that becomes a question with just these access conditions. So I think you hit the two of those, and then otherwise, like the rest of it becomes due diligence for building in general. Like I think on
Yeah.
your list is like, well, septic and utilities and that kind of stuff. Maybe not specific to modular construction, but definitely things to consider.
Yeah, we find that, by the way, I think I say this like every podcast, call planning early. Electric and plumbing is definitely, your life is easier if you can get those to your site. Yeah, that's one of the things. Plus, like, I'd say insane driveways are not as big a deal. Where, those are the things where when people say, hey, can this piece of land work? And again, we see this not just in Tahoe, right? Like again, I mentioned things in Windham, New York, where there's a lot of pretty affordable land. We see these questions as well. And that's our first question usually is like, okay, how challenging is it going to be to get utilities to the location? The other thing that I think that we think about, especially in these winter towns, that I think about honestly much less if someone's building on like a mountain in Santa Rosa or something, is just like, how crazy is the topography going to be when there's multiple feet of snow? And again, Toby probably a much better judge than I am, thinking about, like, what's the degrees you're trying to avoid. I think about this. I know we both cycle as well, but, like, when you start to see driveways more than, like, 8 degrees in these kind of mountain town areas, I start to sort of be like, "Alright, we really need to talk to experts and think about how much of a headache is this gonna be with the livability aspect."
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it sort of depends on what type of services are around, first off, right? If
Right,
you're here in the lake and it's kind of a developed area, there's the snow removal services, and we all sign up for snow plowing and such. Obviously, if you're out on a ranch, very
right.
different kind of situation for sure. Once we hit 10% slope, I think we start to, scratch our chin a little bit on how that's working. Is that, adequate and appropriate? I do think there's an impulse and an instinct to get into the conversation about active melt technologies,
So, like,
some
radiant heated
some
driveways and stuff like that?
radiant heat driveways, hydronics roads, and these kinds of things. You see this around the area as a surprise to people, but it is pretty expensive to
Yeah,
install these systems. We've been working on a couple projects here in Tahoe that are really trying to eliminate gas, which
yeah,
the California Energy Code is really pushing for in certain places. Electricity is pretty, Wyoming, electricity is pretty cheap, but it does take a pretty big service to run an electric driveway melt system. So I think these are kind of natural instincts that can kind of go to how you would deploy these systems. I think it also comes down to surfacing. The other thing about driveways is just how you clear snow. And, gravel's tough for snow blowers, as we know. Concrete's expensive to put in. Asphalt tends to be pretty resilient for snow plowing and snow blowing. And so I think all these go into this sort of access assessment question, and trying to keep driveways at, low slopes is definitely part of the
right.
equation.
And then I encourage everyone, if you're working with an architect who is not from the local area, I would strongly suggest someone who's experienced. Like, you probably don't wanna be the way your architect learns about snowy areas. There's just lots of stuff in terms of, like, snow storage, for example, which is the concept of, like, when the, snow gets plowed, it doesn't just melt.
Put it
So
right.
where do you put it? Like, that's a part of the literally just, like, the sort of after it's surveyed, the plans, like, on the site that we see all the time in those areas. Toby, one question I had for you, and I sort of know the answer because I've seen some of your projects before, is my impression is technology and building, I don't know, the resiliency of building materials and building technologies maybe change some of these answers, but it seems like people's attitudes towards roofs are quite different now than they maybe were, like, 40 or 50 years ago. So we see all these HOAs in Tahoe and other places where there's this rule of, like, "Hey, everyone needs a 412 roof or a 612 roof," which basically means, right, you go up an inch for every 2 inches you go over if it's 612, or if it's 1212, I guess it would be like a 45-degree slope. And I don't know if that was, like, a necessity in terms of shedding snow because structures weren't as strong or water resilient, whatever, 40 or 50 years ago. But it seems like, yeah, a lot of times, like, we're having to educate about why, like, flatter roofs might be okay. What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges of managing snow on a roof is the freeze thaw cycle that happens at the drip edge. People have heard of the phenomena called ice damming, which is literally quite that, where you get a thaw moment or you got heat from your residence, which is pushing water towards the edge of the roof. Of course, it now goes outside the envelope, so it freezes and it over time creates literally a dam. And now I've got water that can't get off the roof. So it starts kind of ponding back across the roof. We install what they call ice and water shields. And in snow country, those water barriers, they go up your roof surface to prevent water from being able to come down through the roof structure as a result of this phenomenon. Well, this happens because we're pushing snow off the roof. And I think we are all aware of the hazard of icicles and things that tend to fall off of roofs. I think ironically for this reason, people will have steeply sloped roofs and then also put snow catchers on the roof to hold the snow.
Right.
So, I've always, I think it's also kind of a common European strategy too. When you look out across like Switzerland and places that are in the mountains, a lot of these, structures historically have had low slope roofs because one of the best ways, in my opinion, to manage snow is to hold it. and to, engineer a building that can carry these loads. I don't find that to be incredibly daunting. It's certainly a rigor, and there's certainly an investment strategy that is associated with building a really robust building. But we like low slope roofs that allow the heat of the home to melt the snow over time and don't create the kind of hazardous problem of a lot of snow melt coming off the structure and creating, piles of snow below the roof, or creating a hazardous problem for icicles, or even just ice that ponds on the ground can be a problem with steeply sloped roofs. I mean, I think people still like sloped roofs. Not everybody likes the idea of having snow on your roof over time. I've experienced in Tahoe. I mean, you've seen it too, Michael. Like when it snows hard here and we get 4 feet of snow in one night, there's 4 feet of snow on everybody's house, no matter how steep your roof is. So I think a lot of this in my mind is a little bit less related to the snow, and it's more related to how we melt the snow over time.
Mhm.
And or not, there are strategies that can be implemented that assist. Now, to your point, one of the technologies that's pretty common in snow country, certainly in a lot of projects that we've done, are heat tape trace lines that are used at the edges of roofs or in gutters or in downspouts. In some instances, we've actually used, vertical roof drains and have run a heat tape element down through those
Right.
drains just to keep them open over the winter. I think this is probably more of a conversation, honestly, about homes that are being built as second homes or rental
Mhm.
property where you don't have somebody living in the building full time.
We
If
see
you're a
fire
full time,
departments require these heating elements some of the times at this point because they're worried
yeah,
about there being, freezing close to, pipes and stuff like.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think if you're in your house full time, if you're a full time resident and the house is always, 68, 70 degrees, it's sort of a
Right.
little bit of a different problem than if you're shutting them down for the week because nobody's
Totally.
there. But I like low slow roofs. I think if you look at, again, across the globe, how have people managed snow historically, you see these different philosophies. And I'm not sure there's an exact right answer here, but I've always preferred low slope roofs for this reason, to just manage the snow a little bit more actively than trying to do it outside the building.
Okay, so we talked about snow shedding on roofs. That's the big one. If you look at the slope of your house, what you don't want to have happen is you don't want everything to point at your front door. So a lot of times what you see is arches or peaks above doors, and you see the home slope out to the sides. So basically the snow loads up in places that people don't walk. That's a big one. Another thing that honestly, like I don't know if we were thoughtful about this enough on our house because we have an enormous, mostly uncovered deck, is the idea of, okay, if you have a deck and you're going to get a huge amount of snow on it, it's actually like there's a question of, okay, that's cool in the summer and it's just a lot of work in the winter. So it's another thing we think about and encourage people to think about. Again, there's bear boxes, which is not a big deal, but a lot of times people in these areas, there's, bears or wildlife. So there's these basically metal containers that hold your trash cans. Again, it's not a big deal, but on site, we tell people to think about where they are in advance because people don't like being like finishing their house and then being told, okay, you have to put a big like metal trash receptacle directly in front of your, front door.
Yeah, I like all that. I think it's, I've always thought it's sort of funny, Michael, that like you see a house in the snow and it has this like perfect thing over the entryway, but then the gable slopes right in front of the garage.
Right.
It's all garage. So I think garages, first off, best practice from my perspective that we try to encourage in all of our projects is to really make sure that your garage and your driveway are as south and west facing as possible. Sunlight on the asphalt and then the front of the garage door. You touched on snow storage. I think it's a big issue in a lot of towns. Those snow piles will stay around until the end of the summer. In some jurisdictions, we do a lot of work in Mammoth Lakes. Snow storage is a minimum requirement of your planning process. You have to demonstrate where the snow storage exists. And there are snow storage easements on the roadway. So as they plow the streets, that the town can pile up snow on the edges of the roads in areas that get a tremendous amount of snow. I think that's a really important part of the considerations for sure.
I think we covered. Oh, last one. By the way, let's see. What did we do cover? We covered snow loads, decks, driveways, slopes. Oh, we've talked about this a little bit, but most of these areas are also high fire risk areas. So you want to be really cognizant on egress in terms of fire retardants. Again, mudrooms, areas for like your toys. A lot of times if you have snowmobiles or snow blowers, etc. Bear box areas.
Yeah,
Really,
care boxes. So One of the things that's that I think you're right. Like a lot of places now, it's required. You have to have a bear-proof box. You have to be able to shovel your bear-proof box
Right.
for trash access. Most trash companies aren't going to do that for you. So a little bit of planning that goes into that. In some cases, we've encouraged bear box planning to also be connected to garage openings. So you could
Right.
almost load your trash one side,
Oh,
the
interesting.
trash company pull it out on
I
the
haven't
other
seen that.
side.
That's
Uh,
cool.
yeah, it's some of the neighborhoods around here, you end up doing that because they don't want the thing out on the corner. But I think you're right. People sometimes get surprised by that. It's
We see the
it's an
same issues. Yeah. We see the same issues with people who some of the towns in Tahoe particularly require you to have propane instead of natural gas. So again, a lot of people want to bury their propane tanks. And then the question is just like, if you bury them in a way that they're like essentially inaccessible to the people who need to refill them during ski season, that's also a problem.
Before we leave roofs, I think
Yeah.
another interesting thing for people to think about that I think there's a variety of opinions about for sure are gutters. It's been a
Nice.
sort of interesting thing to learn about as I practiced professionally for so long is just how people think about gutters in snow country. I think there's a strong philosophy we certainly see a lot in the Sierra where we don't put gutters on
There's no
things.
gutters.
You don't get snow rain, it's mostly
Yeah.
snow. And so what I've seen and my neighbor here, gutters don't perform well if they start collecting a lot of ice and over
Yeah.
time they get bent and move and sometimes fall off buildings. So I people can feel comfortable in a lot of instances not having gutters on buildings and just letting snow melt and drip. We do what's called hardening of the drip line. So you kind of put a gravel edge around the
Yeah.
base of the building. So as the water's dripping, it doesn't create erosion. But it's an interesting thing. The other philosophy is to actually use a heavy gauge metal gutter, which has some expense to it. And then with a heat tape wire, that's another nice way of collecting drip water off of a roof if there's a budget to do that kind of stuff. But I think that the whole gutter question is an interesting one that people will go through with their architects as you're doing some snow management planning on the house.
I mean, honestly, I just assumed I grew up in Boston. We had gutters on our house in Boston, but so I assumed that no gutters was a best practice. I don't think I've seen a
Yeah.
home with gutters in Tahoe or Colorado or Wyoming since we've done this. We've like again done a non-trivial number. Maybe one thing before we get into maybe looking at one or two houses and some FAQs is do you think you can talk a bit about landscape? Because obviously landscaping is again, there's this home hardening aspect, but we're talking about pretty hardcore seasons here. We're talking about areas where, you know, the summer season might be short.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an instinct that I would probably push back on
Yeah.
where because we're up in the mountains, we're not doing landscaping. I
Yeah.
think there is landscaping that's always part of it. Now it's got to be appropriate, right? So we're, choosing fauna that matches well with the
Right.
environment and things that survive the winters is really
Mhm.
important. I think that's part of it. I think to your point, you know, what we're calling firescaping, like these are massive questions on how to have best practices
More
emerge
gravel, less
in
mulch,
snow
stuff
country.
like that.
Yeah, defensible space, super important. Not having a lot of bushes up against your building, super
Yeah.
important. As we were talking in the last podcast, I think these are practices still apply. Landscape architects add value. I mean, most of the projects we work on in the mountains, we're trying to develop a, au natural aesthetic. It
Yeah.
doesn't look manicured. It kind of looks like it was, the landscape. And I think that involves rocks and boulders and rockery walls are really important and commonplace, I think, in a lot of mountain towns. And I think the other piece of this is that most mountain properties have some amenities. Maybe it's your spa, maybe it's your, covered porch of sorts. These things I think all benefit from having landscape design become part of the process. I think mulch gets replaced with pine needles. There's actually a pine needle market where you can buy pine needles of different colors to kind of lay out to cover the ground. But I think people should think just because we're building over the mountains that you're not doing landscaping. You are going to do some. And then, real quick before I forget, one of the things that we've seen on decks, Michael, is that I have clients that just keep a snowblower just on the upper deck.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? These different philosophies, drain
I've seen
through
a lot.
decks
Yeah.
that drip.
Powered. There's all sorts of these. Or
Exactly.
like I think Toro or one of those companies makes it. It's like halfway between a snowblower and a like
A shovel with a little like tread on it, kind of.
yeah, I think it's like a 6-volt snowblower. It's like a pretty soft core snowblower. One thing, by the way, is that I don't think we've seen anyone struggle with this, but we encourage people to look at is Toby talked about amenities. We see a lot of, right, saunas, hot tubs, etc. Warning, and I like all that stuff as much as anyone. I know nobody who doesn't put one in, who doesn't have a significant level of maintenance issues with whatever they have. I think it's just a reality of those things, which is whatever, part of the game. But one thing that we need to be cognizant, given that these are things that need to be maintained, is access. So there are a lot of the sort of companies that they'll put this in their specs, and sometimes the general contractors will listen to them and sometimes they won't. You need really good access to like the panels and the under parts of the hot tub. So just when you're thinking about, hey, we're going to sink this in a deck, we're going to sink this in the ground. Again, you just want to make sure that, look, usually like people, if they know what they're doing, they're building hatches, they're providing for access. But again, like I know no one who doesn't have significant maintenance issues on that. And I know some of the leading companies in these jurisdictions actually won't service your different like saunas or hot tubs if they're sort of built in inaccessible ways because it's not worth their time. So that's another silly one that we try to get people to avoid.
It's a true statement, though. My experience is that mostly the people who provide services to homes in the mountains do not want to shovel snow. So it's either accessible and it's easy and they come in and do it, or you got to take care of it. In which case, like you said, access is so critical, or you're going to have to do it yourself. So
Yeah.
it's a good point. And it applies to a lot of different aspects of the house. It's just good access. It's easy to see it in the summer. It makes sense on the floor plan when you're looking at it. You drop 5 feet of snow on top of it that sits there for the rest of the winter and gets hard as
Toby, I was thinking we could jump in to one or two of your projects. Let's see what we got here. You can see my screen right now. All right. So anyway, if you go to Toby's website, cleverhomes.net, you can see he's done a lot of work on a bunch of really beautiful houses. I assume this is just jumping through from house to house in a variety of places, right? Carbondale, a lot in Truckee, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah,
But yeah, so we can really look at any of these. But maybe you can talk through this house, which it seems like is built into a really steep hill, and talk about
hillside.
some of the
Uh,
considerations.
this home starts with a consideration, as we were just talking about, related to driveways. So the good spot for this property was sort of lower on the hillside.
Mhm.
And there's some early designs for this project that had a kind of a snaking driveway to get down to that little bit lower spot where it kind of flattens out off the road edge and just didn't make any sense for all the reasons. So this sort of got kicked off by understanding how to make the driveway just short, sweet, simple, right off the
You're
road.
saying there's a flatter plateau even below.
Yeah, almost where those little stairs come off with that kind of roof
I
deck
see.
and
Okay,
follow
got
the
it.
path. There's sort of some lower areas
I
down
got
there.
it.
And
So
we
so
didn't
you
want to
you
make
you thought about being one of those Tahoe houses that has 400 stairs to get from the what I'm talking about, the
it
have, like,
or
covered stairway?
exactly, or just like the long driveway down or
Yeah,
having a
yeah, yeah,
detailed
yeah.
garage at the
There.
top. So we just kind of moved everything up, but it really got kicked off by understanding the garage and just how to keep the driveway simple and right off the road. It slopes
Right,
towards the street. That kind of gave us some base elevations. The property didn't want to be up high for a variety of different reasons. So we wanted to get the living areas down. So it's kind of two entries. This has like a door beside the garage. You can kind of go in and come down to this project. This kind of a unique design that has a little bit of a bridge. You can see in the center there, you can actually see underneath the building as you drop down a half set of stairs. That little staircase comes across that bridge and leads over to the open living spaces, which are over there on the right hand side.
yeah.
And then there's an outdoor path. Obviously, that path is a little bit less useful in the winter.
I was
So it's really that upper door, which is kind of the winter
That
access
makes sense. Okay,
and the
yeah,
summer access. Well, it's sort of interesting. In some places, Michael, we've seen design controls. I think, like, yeah, in Sugar Bowl and some other
right.
places I've seen where you're actually required to design, like at Soda Springs, you're required to design, a winter access and a summer access because the snow's piled up to the point where you're probably not going to walk in your front door. Yeah, you're going to be up higher. So it's got a little bit of a lower area and then a kind of upper access point adjacent to the garage. That kicks off this. You can see a little bit of the snow management. We got a really low slope garage, roof over the garage that really holds the snow in that location so it doesn't drip onto the garage door. It sort of slopes towards the back on the other upper portion of the property. We've got our entry door roof kind of slopes away from the entry to keep that area nice and clean. To open up the view, the adjoining section kind of slopes in the other direction. So kind of a playful use
Yeah.
of the roof structures to not only characterize the design, but to speak to a little bit of that snow management place there.
One question, so We talked about areas for snow storage. Obviously, this isn't a huge driveway. Where, if I'm a plow, am I just where am I pushing the snow here?
This just really gets snow blowed. So you got to blow the snow and it blows
Okay.
over the rail on the left. That was the hope anyway. So
Yeah.
I think that's probably where it goes.
What else can you tell us about sort of the considerations behind this project?
Yeah. So just, mountain style use of materials. Again, wood siding, we know the kind of questions that come with that and maintenance and fire hazard. This is siding over fire sheathing to create a
Yeah.
fire barrier. So that's used throughout.
Is the blue wood siding too, or is that like some kind of like composite?
The gray is painted siding.
Okay.
So
Okay,
native
got it.
siding painted to just try to match the metal panels. So all of the darker material
Right,
that
right.
Scotty at the base is a hot rolled steel mounted on a very simple rain screen assembly. Try to, pick up those same details through the window areas to kind of create that cohesive look for all the glazing. And then it kind of shows up as a few other locations to kind of break up the facade and to introduce just a change of material along those edges. Metal fascia at the edges of the roofs to help provide some resiliency. You can see a little bit of that ice formation on the far right-hand side of the upper second story there. So yeah, it's kind of got a good friendly look. Obviously, this is an area that, like a lot of places, have some HOA stuff and got some design controls to navigate. I think stone is just inevitably part of mountain
Yeah.
construction. People probably aren't surprised to hear that masonry is a pretty expensive part of projects. So in the work that we do, it tends to be used fairly carefully, fireplaces and such, to try to use the stone. Yeah, those are some of the basic material treatments. A lot of this design was really to capture the view. You can see a little bit of that comes off of the downslope side of the
Yeah.
property. So orienting rooms this way, a lot of glazing in those living spaces. It has a certain privacy given its location on the site, which allows for it to be pretty open and airy. And, uses a bunch of different mechanical technologies. This is a radiant floor heated home, which is a really great way to heat anything in mountain towns, hydronic heating. So it is throughout very comfortable. We also did air conditioning, which I think people will continually look to, even in mountain towns that tend to be not quite as hot. Inevitably, it seems like these are the conversations emerging in all of our projects. Of course, brings a pretty heavy investment into mechanical technologies themselves, but nothing too active here. We don't have any snow melt systems or anything that's really ambitious or extra layer of resiliency. But yeah, house is performing well and looks good.
So a house like this, the thing that seems honestly most intense about this house is the foundation work on the slope. So from a cost perspective, was this one of those homes where it ended up being that like the foundation and site work ended up like did the sort of 50-50 ratio we sort of talked about last time maintain here, or did this end up being one where actually the site work ended up being the more expensive part of the whole equation?
Well, I think that's sort of a natural condition for a lot of mountain projects.
Yeah.
I have found that foundations are just somewhat challenging in mountain towns anyway. I mean, the upside is that soil conditions tend to be pretty good. We don't get a lot
Totally.
of clay up at elevation. It's a
Right.
lot of sand, a lot of rock, a lot of granite, that kind of stuff. We have some projects in Bear Valley we're doing that has unbelievably high snow loads. Actually, it's on granite. We're actually kind of bolting the house to these rocks, which is an
Oh,
interesting thing we can talk about in another podcast. I mean, I think there's always cost there. Concrete in the mountains tends to be sometimes tough too. A place like Jackson, Wyoming is at the edge of
yeah.
transport distance from the nearest quarry. And so
Yeah.
concrete tends to be expensive. Uh, as you mentioned at the beginning, Michael, concrete work and excavation site work is something that's really limited by the weather schedule. Everybody builds foundations in the summer and then turns
Yeah.
the excavators into snow plows in the winter. But it's a very seasonal part of the project. As a
Yeah.
result, it's really in high demand for everybody building. So I think you get some high costs there. And then, of course, just kind of amenities and such that spill off of the projects like this tend to drive a little bit more cost back into the site side, I think. But I think generally speaking, this project still had a pretty heavy emphasis on the modular elements. The project is entirely modular with the exception of a kind of interesting roof panel that happens at the center of that living area. The living room is made up of a couple of different modules coming together to make that volume. So it's still a pretty heavy investment in the offsite portions of the project, and it was delivered finished. So there's still a decent amount of work that's taking place in the factory, but to your point, I think those ratios can sort of get slanted a little bit as the site work becomes more technical and more expensive by nature.
Are there any other projects, going through a few of them, that you wanted to touch on quickly that you thought were particularly?
These homes that are really contemporary,
Yeah.
I think we sort of deploy the low slope, flat roof kind of strategies. We try to provide some resiliency on those roofs by putting down ballasts or kind of pebbles and stone covers over those roofs that sometimes help aesthetically, but also help performance wise. You kind of see a little glimpse of that roof there, has like a black volcanic rock on top of it that is, part of the roof structure. So I think these sort of play to a little bit of those aesthetics. Again, the use of stone in a selective way in this project, which is kind of built up into an upslope, that becomes a pretty important part of the aesthetic.
Yeah.
These are pretty luxurious homes, so clearly
Big time.
there's an investment into the glass and
Yeah.
other things are a little different for this one. The one that's in Olympic Valley that's sort of near your place is sort of an interesting case study just because it uses, might surprise people, actually an inverted roof. So that project kind of has more of like a butterfly roof
Right.
geometry, which actually is another way of kind of containing the snow. This was an opportunity to kind of lift up the roof structures to catch the views
Right.
out into the woods. So it uses, some slope surfaces, but they tend to kind of aggregate along central areas where we position
On the
roof
interior.
drains. Yeah, that kind of come down in and through the structure. This project does use, heat tape and other things
Right.
to provide an open water course throughout the winter season. But it does keep icicles and things off of those windows. So you've got these unobstructed views throughout the year. So I think this is just kind of a fun, somewhat unanticipated kind of geometry for the project that people might find interesting.
Yeah, we see these
Um,
butterfly roofs a lot in wine country these days on
Sure.
projects there. Some other, like Stillwater Dwelling, which is sort of another kind of fancy. They do them quite frequently, but
Sure.
you don't see them quite as often in Tahoe. So it sounds like you guys made accommodations to make that work with the snow and all that. Uh,
Yeah, it just sort of carries the snow and designed accordingly. So kind of a nice contemporary aesthetic, fairly soft. You can
yeah.
see exposed steel that shows up along some of those ridge lines that we wanted to make part of the aesthetic.
How much do you think about the number of, 'cause we see windows very frequently. One of the things that certain people come to us wanting is this idea of like a passive house, which is, I guess it's like sort of like a certain construction method that is basically really focused on the insulation of the house and just not, you can probably better define it than I am. We've had a few people who are major proponents on the podcast before. They're very focused on the number of openings, making sure everything has no gaps. When you think about the fact that, right, you do need an R18 garage door, you do need higher insulation ratios throughout the house. How do you see windows playing into that, or is it not a big consideration?
Well, I think it's a big consideration. I'm a big fan of doors and windows. So I
Yeah.
think investing into good glazing and having lots of light and natural air is a great place to make an investment in a home. Obviously, people prioritize this differently. Surely it chases back to our architectural vernacular and style. But in most of our projects, we're trying to put in as much glass as we can.
Yeah.
Those are pretty high performance these days, almost in all categories.
Yeah.
Certainly the stuff out of California that's just bound by our rigorous energy code and the compliance therein. Most of the projects that we work on end up having post occupancy testing, like blower door tests or
Yeah.
HERS analysis or other things that demonstrate how the building is sealed properly and how we don't have a lot of air gaps or a lot of leakage
Right.
out of the envelope. I think that as the construction systems technologies and inspection regimes continue to evolve, I think we're all pushing towards this higher performance standard that we expect of
Yeah.
buildings. But I've been pretty amazed at how the window industry continues to advance. This is not just with regard to energy compliance and insulation value, but the coatings on windows, the ability to minimize UV or heat gain and all the things that used to be sort of our problems of the past seem to have been, solved. Even just inexpensive windows these days all have a lot of these core values. And most window companies have an opportunity to upgrade the glazing as well. So yeah, I mean, it hasn't been a massive point
Yeah.
of analysis in a lot of our projects. We're not kind of working in that way so much as trying to really capture an aesthetic or an opportunity for views or sunlight. Um, Kind of work backwards towards engineering the building after we've captured, kind of the architectural values. I know that's maybe not a totally popular thing to say, but I think naturally for the kind of work that we're doing anyway, people are looking at
I
it
think
as a
it's certainly how it often happens on these custom homes.
yeah.
Uh,
I mean, if you have a passive house goal, I mean,
right.
having some engineering strategies that then facilitate design seems natural, but those can be also sometimes challenging conditions in a place that's more moderate in climate, trying to not have a real temperature differential and trying to capture passive house strategies isn't quite the same. The mountains are a good place to try to do passive heating in the winter and keeping, your eaves at the right point so we get sunlight coming in the winter. And then in the summer, it's sort of guarded for this. I mean, a lot of best practices, maybe another podcast just in the making. I mean, I think particularly the mountains windows are just kind of where people's heads are if you've got stuff to look at.
Okay, last two questions, and these sort of get to a little bit more kind of the sort of general questions we get, but I think they cover a huge part of the audience. We talked about one of them a little bit. So someone comes to you, I'm sure this happens to you, it happens to us many, many times a month, and says, "Hey, I found this great piece of land. I just want to figure out how to basically do this off grid. Like, I just want my little bit of, you know, whatever, like a little bit of land with my home and, connecting to everything else. It sounds fine, but I'm focused on keeping cost controlled, keeping infrastructure controlled. And yeah, what do you say to that person? We typically have slightly different answers for slightly different states, but mostly it's this is really hard. Here's probably the minimum you need to do, or you need to look into like a fully off grid system, which I think is hard beyond a certain size home. But yeah, how do you answer those people?
So I think about it from a couple of perspectives. I mean, one, I think it's a natural instinct, not even just for being in a rural spot or mountains, but I think just given, concerns about the ongoing reliance of our energy grid in all parts
Yeah.
of the country. So I also think that technology is advancing pretty quickly in this way too. And so
Mhm.
there's things that are available now that we didn't have, even a few years ago.
Yeah.
So I think first off, there are, in some places you have an obligation to connect to the grid if you can.
Yeah.
So if you're in the middle of a suburban area, you may have an obligation to connect
Right.
into a power grid, even if you don't intend to use that power. You may have a statutory or a
You
legal
get a
obligation
CO.
to
Yeah.
make those connections. I think, secondly, as we think about off the grid systems, the question that seems to be coming up in all of our projects this way is the potential use of a generator. The generator is an interesting question because it is a pretty affordable way to be sort of off the grid, but also requires a fuel source. If you're going to be all electric, which is a lot of our projects and clearly the trend, generators aren't as productive, in which case now we're back into battery storage and
Right.
other kinds of that, are electric by nature. Then to your point, you start getting into kind of a cost analysis, cost
Right.
benefit kind of
And
analysis.
generators are a couple $1,000 versus battery systems
Yeah,
in the tens of
15
thousands. Yeah.
versus 60, or
Yeah.
whatever. So I think you can kind of see that go both ways. I think some of the smart panels and some of the smart batteries are starting to shift this
Oh,
around a little. I even suspect that as, electric cars become, I think Ford has an ability to like plug in
yeah.
the light in
Starting
your
to do
house or
stuff.
whatever,
Yeah.
Rivian. So there's probably some conversation, that's going to continue to take place there. I mean, I do think it's common in a place like California where we know our energy grid is suspect to fire hazard and other types of things where we get shut down. I don't hear it quite as much in Wyoming. It seems like the energy grid is pretty reliable. Most of the distribution is below grade. So the kind of concern about the reliance on the grid is a little different for our clients in the Wyoming area than they are in the California area. And so there's kind of just maybe a philosophical question about what we're really concerned about. I think the technologies are there to support any amount of capacity that people are thinking about. I do sort of believe that, being fully off the grid without a power connection at all is going to be one category versus the other category where you do have a grid connection, but you're trying not to use it. I think there's a slight difference there. Or if you're trying to protect against outages,
I think about water as
we've
not
been doing
totally trivial. Are you drilling wells? How are you getting water?
the systems are pressurized. So
Good.
we know that, if a big earthquake out here and the power systems go down, we don't have water either. And so there's, some question about that. not every place allows you to drill wells if you have municipal supplies, and in
Right.
other places we're just going to be part of the equation. One of the things that I see kind of interestingly, particularly up in the mountain towns, are community water grids. And if you guys are running into those, but HOAs form up or subdivisions form up, they'll have wells that pump into a larger storage vessel that then feeds down or whatever into a bunch of
Yeah.
houses. And these kind of hybrid community style utilities, I think, are common.
Yeah. We see that there's some of that in wine country, actually, like in some of these
Yeah,
more rural
totally.
areas. Uh,
Yeah, and I think there could be some movement to create, micro energy grids too, where there's, shared access to solar arrays and other kinds of things in the future. We'll see how
yeah.
that, kind of manifests. But I think that these mountain projects kind of, facilitate this type of thinking that ultimately benefits in some way, a lot of different kinds of projects. So yeah, I mean, I think these are good considerations, and I am way more optimistic about being off the grid, in today's date than I was 20 years ago, where it just seemed like it was not as reliable. Of course, it was being done for sure, but I think some of the smart technologies are kind of the key here to, move power around your house in the right places at the right time, and with the right solar array, that could work pretty effectively.
Yeah. And then I guess the
Yeah.
other question that we get a lot, which is we try to be pretty unbiased, like we'll give people whatever solution works for them, is I would say we are broadly speaking more favorable towards modular in ski towns than maybe in any other jurisdiction except for maybe island towns. Island towns are right, like Nantucket, I think, has the highest concentration of modular homes of anywhere in the entire country. There's some stat like that. But basically, I actually think it makes a lot of sense relative to stick building in these areas in terms of the labor supply, in terms of the speed. But yeah, how do you see? I know you've talked to me in general about how you've been quite open to stick build to different kinds of kits. Where do you see that falling out? And obviously, it's a project by project decision.
I think it's the same, Michael. I mean, site construction requires a lot of manpower, and fair play to a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's just expensive. It's hard. Mostly, it seems like these markets are being elevated by high value, high end construction projects. I think that has affected the market for everyone else. It's becoming very expensive to hire local people that have other larger projects potentially in competition with your own. So I think modular building makes just a lot of sense. I think that the weather cycle, like you mentioned, is just a real great reason to consider modular building. You can
Mhm.
get a lot of work done while there's a bunch of snow on the ground, and try to deliver a building in the spring. I think that's another just important topic for people to understand. Maybe not surprising. We really try our best to not deliver a modular building at the beginning of winter.
Yeah.
The challenges of modular construction, as you may have experienced, is just keeping the building warm and dry over the course of the winter. Of course, it has all of its finishes, right? So our cabinetry, our sheetrock, our insulation is going to be sitting there, through January, February, March, and being able to have good weather protection on the building is really important consideration for people, their architects, the contractors, for sure. Modular, doesn't work stylistically in the mountains sometimes. I think there's still a be aesthetic for, log homes. There's only one way to build a log home.
Right.
I think having a lot of exposed structural elements, which I think is part of how mountain language sometimes emerges if it's not in the contemporary side of this vernacular. I think that sometimes all the exposed timbers and elements that we associate with mountain vocabulary is sometimes better just as a site assembled kind of consideration. So yeah, I mean, I think about these things really about where's the rub. I think the rub is mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and finishing.
Mm.
Framing sometimes, but really it's those trades that seem to me to be hardest to connect with and in the highest demand. So if we can bring in a mod that's got all that stuff done, we can add timbers and we can add logs, and you can make all the other stuff happen, locally, I think a bit more effectively than
Oh,
trying to sort
quick question on that.
contractors alone.
This is getting really nerdy. When you guys do a project, right? So just so and when people are talking about MEP, so like obviously the house typically will have the internal plumbing mostly done in the factory, but then there's this concept called crossover connections, right? Which is the mods do not ship connected typically, right? They ship down the road disconnected. So you need to actually connect all of the different parts once you get to site. Are you typically having the local the local labor do that, or are you like through the GC? Are you having the factory labor because they put in a lot of the stuff, do the crossovers as well? How does that typically work on projects?
I don't know of that many operations
Yeah.
that do stitch work. Those
Yep.
crossovers is sometimes lumped into that term
Yeah.
called stitch.
Totally.
Just seems to me that those sub trades are, they're planted, they're in the shop, they have their tools there, they're not flying all over
Yeah.
the place, how to make those kind of connections. So usually that happens on site
Yeah.
with subcontractors that are affiliated with the general contractor.
Right.
And then different ways of doing that from, running to central hubs versus doing mod to mod connections.
Right.
And
Right. Right.
there's pros and cons in all these trades, depending upon what that system is.
Got it. Yeah. We've seen some of both. And honestly, like as a non-trivial percentage of the issues we have on projects end up just being making sure everyone's like fully coordinated between.
Yeah, what we've been advocating for, if it's possible, and I appreciate that
Yeah.
there are costs and coordination here, but instead of having the shop people, go out to the field and do
Right.
things, I actually think it's better to do the opposite. Have the field people go to the shop, you
Yeah. You
know,
usually will at least have the GC come and spend some
the
time.
GC for sure, but we've gotten really good benefits from having the electricians
Okay.
go or
Yeah.
getting mechanical contractors to go. I think, as we all know, building is still an art form. Everybody's got their own kind of
Unwritten
ideas.
things that are like not in the plans about like, here's where XYZ thing.
Just getting those people on the same page, having your local electrician know what to expect when the boxes show up,
Yeah.
hugely valuable. So
Yeah. That makes
I think those are good observations, good advice for anybody considering a project like this.
cool. Well, Toby, thanks again. This was awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I hope you get some good skiing this week and we'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks,
Bye,
sir.
everybody. Cheers.